The Aurelia, perched atop a skyscraper in the heart of Chicago, was less a restaurant and more a cathedral dedicated to the worship of wealth. Its silence was a commodity, bought and paid for by men who measured their lives in market shares and acquisitions. For Alara Vance, a 20-year-old waitress whose world was a constellation of bus schedules and mounting medical debt, that silence was the sound of her own invisibility. Her uniform, a severe sheath of black fabric with a prim white apron, was a shroud for the person she'd once been. A girl who had lived and breathed a world of 64 black and white squares. Tonight, that ghost was about to be summoned. Her focus was Table 12, the prime alcove with a panoramic view of the city's glittering nervous system. It was occupied by Alistair Finch. Finch wasn't merely rich, he was a gravitational force. The founder of Finch Global, a private equity firm that devoured companies like a black hole, he moved with the predatory stillness of a patient shark. His face, all sharp angles and piercing gray eyes, was a permanent fixture in the financial press. He saw the world not as a place to live, but as a complex system of assets to be leveraged and liabilities to be eliminated. Flanking him were two of his senior partners, Donovan Hayes and Cynthia Lowell, their laughter a carefully calibrated tribute to his power. Ilara moved with the practiced grace of a phantom, her steps soundless on the plush carpet. "More water, Mr. Finch?" she asked, her voice a placid, professional murmur. Alistair didn't look at her. He made a curt, dismissive gesture with a hand that wore a watch worth more than her apartment building. He was dissecting a recent corporate raid. The key to the Sterling acquisition wasn't capital, Donovan. It was pressure. We didn't buy them. We broke them. We found the weak point in their King's Defense, a subsidiary bleeding cash, and we exploited it until the entire structure collapsed. "A textbook endgame, Alistair," Donovan said, though his tone held a note of something more complex than simple admiration. As Ilara refilled the glasses, her gaze drifted past Alistair's impeccably tailored shoulder. In a shadowed corner of the alcove, on a rosewood pedestal table, sat a vintage Jacques of London chessboard. The pieces, carved from boxwood and ebony, were set mid-game, covered by a fine sheen of dust, like a tiny, forgotten Pompeii. A jolt, electric and agonizing, shot through her. It was a physical pain, a memory so potent it soured the air in her lungs. She remembered the heft of a weighted bishop, the cool, smooth surface of a rook. She remembered the scent of old libraries, the roar of a hushed crowd, and the crushing, soul-shattering silence of a single, catastrophic mistake. She forced the memory down, a familiar act of psychic violence. But Alistair Finch, a man who built an empire on noticing details others missed, caught the flicker in her eyes. He followed her gaze to the dusty board, a slow, cruel smile, the smile of a cat who has just spotted a loose thread on the universe's tapestry, curled his lips. He was bored. The deal was done, his sycophants were predictable, and the 60-year-old Scotch was failing to entertain him. He craved a real problem to solve. "You play?" he asked. The question sliced through the room's hushed reverence. Ilara froze, the crystal water pitcher suddenly feeling as heavy as a lead ingot. For an instant, she wasn't a waitress in Chicago. She was 14, seated across a polished table from her own father, the weight of his dreams a suffocating pressure on her chest. She blinked, the mirage dissolving. "Sir?" He nodded toward the board. "That game, the War of Minds. Do you know the moves?" The question was layered with a condescending amusement. It was the tone one used to ask a child if they knew how to tie their own shoes. "A little," she managed, the words sticking in her throat. It was a long time ago. Her only desire was to melt back into the invisibility of her role. "Excellent," Alistair declared, rising from his chair with a fluid motion. He strode to the small table and, with a flick of a silk pocket square, cleared a patch of dust from the board. "Let's have a match. The conversation has become inefficient." Cynthia and Donovan exchanged a look of disbelief mixed with glee. Alistair Finch, the Titan, about to play chess with a serving girl. It was a perfectly perverse piece of theater. "Sir, I couldn't," Ilara protested, her heart beginning a frantic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. "I'm on duty." Her manager, the perpetually anxious Mr. Dubois, who had been observing the high-value table from a safe distance, scurried over like a nervous crab. "Is everything to your satisfaction, Mr. Finch?" "Perfectly, Dubois," Alistair said, his eyes never leaving Alara. "Your employee and I are about to engage in a friendly bit of sport, a mental palate cleanser." Dubois paled. "But she is working, sir. It is against all protocol." Alistair's smile did not vanish. It hardened, turning from amusement to ice. "Are you refusing my request?" The words were soft, but they carried the implicit threat of a financial apocalypse for the restaurant. The Finch global corporate account could keep Aurelia afloat for a decade. The manager's professional spine turned to jelly. He swiveled to face Alara, his expression a desperate silent scream. "Do as the gentleman says, Vance, immediately. Don't be difficult." She was trapped. Every nerve ending shrieked, "Run! Feign a headache, spill a drink, do anything." But then she saw the face of her younger brother, Liam, in her mind's eye, his smile thin but stubborn in the sterile white of his hospital room. This job, this soul-crushing, invisible job, was his lifeline. Losing it wasn't an option. Taking a breath that felt like she was inhaling ground glass, she gave a single, tight nod. "Splendid," Alistair purred, indicating the chair opposite him. He sat, the picture of the aristocratic leisure. "Don't you worry," he added, his voice oozing a patronizing charm as she hesitantly took her seat. "I'll make it quick." Cynthia and Donovan repositioned their chairs, settling in for the spectacle. Alara looked down at the board, at the 32 pieces that had once been her entire world. They weren't just carved wood. They were soldiers, confidants, and traitors. She clasped her hands in her lap, willing them to stop shaking. Deep within the ruins of her past, the ghost of a forgotten prodigy began to stir. Not with excitement, but with a cold, simmering rage. The game began as a public display of Alistair's magnanimity. He reset the board with the swift, precise movements of a seasoned player, the sharp clack of the pieces the only sound in the wrapped alcove. He gestured for Alara to take the white pieces. "The opening move is yours," he said, leaning back, "a courtesy for the novice." Cynthia Lowell let out a delicate silvery laugh. "Be gentle, Alistair. You wouldn't want to break her spirit." The joke landed in the silent room, highlighting the chasm between their worlds. Alara's mind was a maelstrom. Humiliation warred with a deep, aching sorrow. This beautiful, perfect universe of infinite possibility, the language she had once spoken more fluently than English, was being desecrated, turned into a billionaire's cheap entertainment. He wasn't playing chess. He was playing with a person he considered less than a piece on his board. But as she reached for a pawn, the familiar geometry of the squares, the pull of the pieces, began to assert its old magic. The waitress receded. The commander took her place. Her first move was pawn to d4. The queen's pawn game. Solid, strategic, less common for beginners than the king's pawn. It was a subtle deviation, a whisper of competence she immediately regretted. She should have played the most basic move possible. Alistair replied instantly with knight to f6, the Indian defense, his eyes not on the board but on Donovan. "The final valuation for the sterling deal comes in tomorrow. I expect it to reflect a 30% margin at minimum." Alara's next move was pawn to c4. Again, standard, developing control of the center. She was playing from the manual, the chapter titled, "How to Not Immediately Reveal You Are a Grandmaster." The plan was simple. Play defensively, make a few obvious blunders, get checkmated quickly, and escape. Survive. Alistair countered with pawn to e6, still barely glancing at the game. "Your turn," he said, waving a dismissive hand. For the next dozen moves, the game followed a script she wrote in her head, a tragedy of deliberate errors. She played with a crippling passivity. She ignored open files, missed simple forks, and offered trades of bishops for knights that slightly worsened her position. Each move was a betrayal of her own mind, a small act of self-mutilation. It felt like a virtuoso violinist being forced to play chopsticks with mittens on. Her instincts screamed at her. "He's overextended his queen's bishop. You can trap it. Why are you allowing him to build a pawn chain in the center? His king is still uncastled. Punish him." Alistair was becoming visibly bored. He was winning, of course, but it was like shooting fish in a barrel. There was no artistry, no challenge. This was proving to be a tedious waste of his time. "You're quite cautious," he commented, his voice flat with disappointment. He captured one of her pawns with his knight, a move she had accidentally left undefended. "You must learn to see the entire board, not just the piece in front of you. Every piece is a resource." He was lecturing her. He was explaining the basic tenets of a game she had mastered before she could legally drive. Cynthia stifled a delicate yawn. Donovan checked the time on his phone. The spectacle was losing its shine. It was his condescension that finally shattered her control. It wasn't just his arrogance. It was his profound, blasphemous disrespect for the game. He saw the board as another balance sheet, the pieces as assets to be liquidated. He had no love for the quiet beauty of a zugzwang, the elegant brutality of a discovered check, the silent poetry of a well-played endgame. He had just moved his queen to b3, creating a simple two-pronged attack on two of her undefended pawns. It was a common tactic against amateurs, designed to overwhelm and disorient. He was trying to humiliate her with a beginner's maneuver. That was the spark. A flicker of cold fire ignited in Alara's eyes. The waitress finally died, and the phantom took her seat. The voice of her father, a man both brilliant and cruel, echoed in her memory. "The board is a mirror, Alara. It shows them who they are. Then it shows them who you are." Alistair was smiling, that predatory, self-satisfied smile, waiting for her to panic and lose one of the pawns. "The pressure mounts," he said with a theatrical sigh. "Choices, choices." Alara looked at the board. She saw his clumsy, obvious threat, but she also saw something else, something 5 moves deep, a subtle geometric weakness he had created in his own position. In his rush to attack, he had left a single square, f2, protected only by his king. It was a microscopic flaw, a hairline crack in the foundation of his fortress. Her hand hovered over her knight, the piece she was supposed to move to defend one of the pawns. It was the safe move, the weak move, the waitress's move. But her fingers closed around her own bishop, tucked away on c8, a piece that hadn't moved the entire game. She slid it forward 5 squares with a single fluid motion, bishop to h3. It was a move that made no sense. It was quiet. It didn't capture a piece. It didn't defend her pawns. To Cynthia and Donovan, it looked like a bizarre, pointless gesture, perhaps even a sign of resignation. But to Alistair Finch, it was a declaration of war. The move did nothing and everything. It placed no immediate check, but it pinned his knight on f3 to his queen. More importantly, it took lethal aim at the periphery of his position, a silent sniper taking up its post. It was a move that completely ignored his threat, imposed a far more sophisticated and deadly one of its own. It was not a beginner's move. It was the move of a ghost. Alistair's smile didn't just falter. It evaporated. For the first time all evening, he leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table, and truly looked at the board. He saw his own crude attack, and then he saw her bishop, a dagger pointed at the throat of his king's defense. He looked up at her, really looked at her, at the waitress with the haunted eyes and the hand that was now as steady as granite. And for the first time since he had founded his empire, Alistair Finch felt a sliver of genuine, unadulterated fear. The game had changed, or rather, it had just begun. The lazy, contemptuous atmosphere in the alcove evaporated, replaced by a silence so thick it felt like a physical pressure. Cynthia and Donovan, who had been on the verge of checking their emails, now stared at the board, sensing the seismic shift in the room's emotional tectonics. They couldn't comprehend the strategy, but they could read their boss's face, and the expression on it was one they had never seen before. Absolute, razor-sharp focus, tinged with disbelief. Alistair's mind, a machine honed for ruthless calculation, kicked into overdrive. The bishop on h3 was an absurdity. It was a provocation. It was a move that said, "Your petty threats are irrelevant. Your entire strategy is flawed, and I have been waiting for you to make this exact mistake." He had been playing against a child, and she had just revealed herself to be a grandmaster in disguise. "A clever, if desperate, gambit," he said, his voice a low growl. He was trying to reassert control, to frame her brilliance as a reckless gamble. He moved his king to h1, a cautious defensive step, breaking the pin on his knight. He was forced to react to her. He had lost the initiative. It was Alara's turn. The conflict within her was over. The phantom was now in command. She was no longer playing to survive the evening. She was playing to reclaim a piece of her own soul. Her next move was knight to c6, simple, elegant, developing a piece. She was methodically dismantling his center while he was distracted by the ghost on the edge of the board. A murmur rippled through the small gathering crowd of staff and curious patrons at the edge of the dining room. Mr. Dubois watched, wringing his hands, his face a mask of pure terror. This was a disaster. Waitresses were not supposed to give titans a moment of doubt. Alistair's fortress of arrogance had been breached. He abandoned his previous attack and launched a new, furious assault, throwing his pawns forward in the center, trying to blast open the position with brute force. It was the boardroom tactic he knew best: overwhelming power, shock, and awe. But Alara's defense was like a spider's web, yielding, flexible, and deadly. Each of his aggressive moves was met with a quiet, precise counter that seemed to subtly improve her own position. Her pieces moved with a terrifying harmony, a silent symphony of strategic depth. She gave up a pawn to gain control of a key diagonal. She repositioned a knight to a seemingly passive square, only for it to become a monstrous threat 3 moves later. She was playing a different game, one that existed in the future, while he was still reacting to the present. Cynthia leaned toward Donovan. "What in God's name is happening?" she whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "She's a ringer," Donovan breathed, his eyes glued to the board. "He's not playing a waitress, he's playing a professional." The critical moment arrived on the 28th move. Alistair, growing increasingly frustrated by her flawless, wraith-like defense, made a microscopic miscalculation. In a complex sequence of exchanges, he recaptured a piece with his rook instead of his pawn, a move that felt more aggressive but left his back rank fatally weakened for a fraction of a second. To 99% of players, it was a meaningless choice. To Alara, it was the key to the entire kingdom. She didn't hesitate. Her next move was a sacrifice so profound, so shocking, it drew a collective gasp from the onlookers. She moved her queen to d1, offering it up to be captured by his rook. Alistair froze, his hand hovering over his piece. It was a trick, a poisoned gift. He scanned the board for 10 agonizing minutes, the noise of the restaurant fading into a dull roar in his ears. The logic was screaming at him. Take the queen, you win the game. His pride, his ego, the very core of his being told him that she had finally cracked, that this was the desperate blunder of a cornered amateur. He couldn't see the trap. The trap was too beautiful, too complex. He took the queen. "A fatal mistake," he announced, his voice booming with forced confidence, trying to reclaim the narrative. "You've lost your most powerful piece." Alara looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of something, not pity, not triumph, but a deep, weary sadness, showed in her eyes. Then she moved her rook. Rook to e1. Check. It was a simple check, delivered across the now open file. Alistair, annoyed, moved his king to the only safe square, g2. Then came her knight. It leaped from the shadows to f3. Check. The knight was protected by a pawn. Alistair was forced to move his king again, to g1. And then she unleashed the weapon she had placed on the board, what felt like a lifetime ago. The quiet bishop on h3. Bishop to g2. It wasn't a check, it was a seal. It blocked the king's last escape square. Then with a final devastating calm, Alara slid her remaining rook from a1 all the way across the board to h1. Checkmate. Silence. A profound, absolute silence that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. The word hung there, irrefutable and eternal. Alistair Finch's king was trapped, a prisoner in its own castle, slain by an army he had never even seen. The game was over. Donovan's jaw hung open. Cynthia stared, speechless. Mr. Dubois looked as if he was about to collapse. Alistair Finch stared at the board, his face ashen. He traced the lines of the attack. The sacrificed queen, The relentless rooks, the quiet, patient bishop that had delivered the killing blow from across the board. It was a masterpiece of strategic assassination, and he had not only allowed it, he had participated in it, a willing accomplice in his own execution. He hadn't been defeated. He had been dismantled, piece by piece, by a superior intelligence. He slowly raised his eyes from the carnage on the board to the woman sitting opposite him. The waitress. The invisible girl he had plucked from the background to be his plaything. She was calmly, almost sadly, placing his captured queen back on the table, her expression one of resignation, as if this outcome had been a foregone conclusion from the moment he had spoken to her. "How?" Alistair whispered, the single word a monument to his shattered ego. "How is that possible?" The silence that followed Alistair's whispered question was a vacuum, drawing the attention of everyone left in the restaurant. His persona, an impenetrable fortress of wealth and power, had been publicly demolished. He replayed the game in his mind, not as a series of moves, but as a conversation. He had shouted and she had answered in poetry. He had blustered and she had replied with logic as cold and beautiful as a star. He looked up at her, the condescension in his eyes replaced by a raw, burning intrigue. This was no longer about a game. It was about an impossible reality. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low, stripped of all its earlier arrogance. Before Alara could formulate a reply, Mr. Dubois came rushing forward, his face slick with a desperate sweat. "Mr. Finch, my sincerest apologies for this unprofessional display. Vance, you are dismissed. Report to my office at once. Your behavior is beyond unacceptable." He was trying to perform a public execution, offering Alara as a scapegoat to appease the wounded titan. Alara felt the cold dread of reality rush back in. She had won the game. She was about to lose the job that kept her brother alive. The ghost in her may have been a queen, but the girl in the uniform was just a pawn. "She will stay where she is," Alistair commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through Dubois' panicked tirade like a surgeon's scalpel. He didn't even glance at the manager. His gaze was locked on Alara. "I asked her a question, Dubois. Not you." The manager froze, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "I'm a waitress," Alara said quietly, her eyes dropping back to the board. It was the truth, but it had never felt more like a lie. "No," Alistair said, shaking his head with a slow, deliberate motion. "That was not a waitress. I have played against national masters for charity. I have studied the games of Alekhine, of Fischer, of Kasparov. That," he gestured to the final perfect position on the board, "was a crucifixion. That was art. So I will ask you one more time. Who are you?" Ilora remained silent, her jaw set. To speak of her past was to unlock a tomb filled with pain and failure. That world was dead to her. The phantom was a ghost for a reason. Alistair saw the defiance, the steel behind her silence. It only fanned the flames of his curiosity. His pride was in ashes, but his intellect was ablaze. He had stumbled upon a riddle wrapped in an enigma, wearing a waitress's uniform. And Alistair Finch did not leave riddles unsolved. He leaned forward, a new and dangerous light in his eyes. The shock had subsided, replaced by the predatory focus of a strategist facing a new, infinitely more interesting game. "Fine. You won't tell me. Let's play again." "Sir, I can't," Alara said, shaking her head. "I have to work." "Nonsense." Alistair waved a hand, already beginning to reset the pieces. "I am the work. I am the client, and I demand another game." His voice took on a sharper edge. "Let's raise the stakes." He retrieved a slim, obsidian checkbook and a heavy gold pen from his jacket. "One game. Winner take all. If you win," he paused, scrawling furiously on the check. "You take this." He tore it out and slid it across the chessboard. It came to rest beside her captured king. Ilara glanced down. Her vision wavered, the room seeming to tilt on its axis. Written on the check in Alistair's sharp, aggressive script was the sum of $500,000. $500,000. It was an impossible number, a figure from a different reality. It was Liam's experimental CAR T-cell therapy. It was a specialist in Boston. It was an end to the crushing, suffocating weight of debt. It was hope. It was a miracle. and it was an insult. He was trying to do it again. He was trying to turn this back into a transaction, to reduce her art, her soul, to a number on a balance sheet. It was the only language he understood. This wasn't a prize, it was a test. Was she a person with a gift, or just a clever commodity that could be bought? No, she said, her voice a near whisper, but firm. She pushed the check back across the board. Alistair's eyebrows shot into his hairline. Donovan and Cynthia looked at each other, their faces screaming the same thought. She's insane. I beg your pardon? Alistair said, genuinely stunned. I will not play you for money, Alara stated, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. She rose from her chair, her brief, terrifying reign as queen of the alcove seemingly over. I need to get back to my job. Excuse me. She turned, but his voice, now laced with Arctic frost, stopped her dead. What if I ensure you no longer have a job to get back to? He said. Dubois, if this young lady refuses to play me again, Finch Global and all its holdings will be withdrawing its patronage from this establishment and its parent company. Permanently. I will personally make it my mission to inform every one of my associates about the inhospitable service at the Aurelia. Mr. Dubois looked as though he might actually die of fright. The Finch account was the crown jewel of the hotel's revenue. He turned to Alara, his eyes bulging with a terror so profound it was almost comical. Vance, for the love of God, please, he whimpered. Just play the man. The trap snapped shut. She was cornered by his power, by her manager's pathetic desperation, and by the ever-present ghost of Liam's illness. The check lay on the table, a venomous, seductive promise. She looked from the check to Alistair's hard, challenging gaze, then to the quivering wreck of her manager. She was trapped. But if she was going to be a piece in his game, she would decide the rules. She sat back down, her movements slow and deliberate. She ignored the check. Her eyes met Alistair Finch's. One more game, she said, her voice now as clear and cold as ice. The timid waitress was gone, perhaps forever. But not for your money. Alistair leaned back, a slow, dangerous smile returning to his face. He was intrigued. Then what, pray tell, are we playing for? Alara held his gaze, and for the first time, she allowed a fraction of the phantom's cold genius to show through, letting him glimpse the abyss of her history. If I win, she said, each word precisely placed, you will go to the largest news outlet you can find, Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, I don't care which, and you will give a full, on-the-record interview detailing your biggest professional failure. Not a small misstep, a catastrophic error in judgment. You will explain, in your own words, how you were wrong, how you were beaten, and what you learned from it. The smile vanished from Alistair's face. She was demanding more than money. She was demanding a pound of his flesh, an attack on the one thing he held sacred, his reputation for infallibility. And if I win, he countered, his voice a low growl. If you win, Alara replied, I'll tell you everything. The wager was set, not for wealth, but for truth, not for a check, but for a soul. The pieces were reset. The war was about to begin. The second game bore no resemblance to the first. The pretense of a friendly match was gone. This was a bare-knuckle brawl fought in the silent language of kings and pawns. The atmosphere in the alcove was electric, charged with an intellectual savagery that was more gripping than any physical confrontation. Alistair, playing as white, opened with an aggressive variant of the Sicilian defense, a complex and tactical opening favored by players who seek conflict from the very first move. It was a statement of intent. There will be no hiding. There will be no subtlety. I am coming for you. Alara met his aggression not with defense, but with a calculated counterattack, steering the game into a labyrinth of sharp tactical lines where a single misstep would be fatal. She was telling him, I am not afraid of the dark. They played with a speed that was bewildering to the onlookers. Moves were made and answered almost instantaneously, a blur of hands and clicking pieces. To the untrained eye, it was chaos. To the initiated, it was a conversation between two brilliant minds, each anticipating the other's thoughts, each setting traps within traps. For Alara, every move was a step back into a past she had tried to cremate and scatter. Alistair's ferocious night sortie was a mirror of a game she'd played against a Russian prodigy in St. Petersburg when she was 12. Her own fianchettoed bishop, a long-range defensive piece, was a technique her father had drilled into her for hundreds of hours. Patience, Alara. His voice a phantom echo in her mind, sharp and demanding. Let him think he has the attack. A true predator doesn't charge. It waits. It lets the prey exhaust itself, make a mistake, and then it strikes. Her father, Andrei Vanescu, had been a chess master himself, a man whose love for the game was eclipsed only by his obsessive ambition for his daughter. He had seen her gift when she was 6, a preternatural ability to see the board not as a static object, but as a fluid field of geometric force. He had molded her, coached her, pushed her until the game was no longer a joy, but a duty. He had given her the title that the small, insular world of elite chess had come to know her by, the Wraith of Romania, for her unnerving, almost supernatural style. Alistair sacrificed a pawn to open lines for his rooks, a bold, speculative move designed to seize the momentum. For a moment, Alara felt a genuine thrill of danger. His attack was powerful, his king's position seemed unassailable. The pressure was immense. It was in moments like these that her father's training had been at its most brutal. She remembered a session in a grim, fluorescent-lit hotel room in Prague. She was 14. He had set up a position where she was down a full rook, a seemingly hopeless disadvantage. She had wanted to resign. Never resign. He had roared, sweeping the pieces from the board in a rage. Resignation is a disease of the will. The board always holds a secret, a hidden resource, a path to victory that the lesser mind cannot see. You must be worthy of seeing it. She had cried that night, but she had studied the position for 6 hours until she found it. A quiet pawn move that led to a forced draw. She had not been worthy of victory, but she had been worthy of survival. Now facing Alistair's onslaught, she looked for the secret. She ignored the obvious threats, the screaming claxons of his attack, and looked deeper into the silent, geometric soul of the position. And there it was, a subtle, almost invisible flaw in his pawn structure, a single weak square he had neglected in his lust for the attack. She didn't defend, she counterattacked. While his army was laying siege to her king, her queen slipped out a side door and began to decimate his undefended flank. Alistair let out a guttural sound of frustration, forced to pull his pieces back, his beautiful, coordinated attack crumbling into a panicked defense. The momentum had not just shifted, it had reversed like a tidal wave crashing back upon itself. While the silent war raged, a digital one was unfolding on the screen of Donovan Hayes' phone. Unable to watch his boss be vivisected any longer, he had turned to the only weapon he had, information. He was a master of corporate intelligence, and he was now applying that skill to the mystery waitress. Simple searches yielded nothing. Alara Vance chess. No results, but Donovan was methodical. He expanded his search terms. Female chess prodigy, disappeared, Romanian. He scrolled through old articles, forum posts from the early 2000s, his eyes scanning for a name, a face. Meanwhile, the hushed live stream started by a busboy had exploded. The title, Billionaire Alistair Finch in Chess Bloodbath with Mystery Waitress at Aurelia, was irresistible. The viewer count surged past 100,000. Chess forums were alight with activity as grandmasters and amateurs alike screenshotted the blurry feed, analyzing the game. On a chess.com forum, a user from Hungary posted, "This bishop sacrifice in the second game. The positional understanding is not human. It is the style of the Vanescu school. But the creativity, the sheer nerve. I have only seen one player with that signature, the Wraith." The name echoed through the digital ether. The Wraith? You mean Alara Vanescu? Impossible. She vanished after the 2014 World Youth Championship, fell off the face of the earth. Another user replied, "She had a complete breakdown after that final match against Volkov. They say her father had a stroke right after. She never played again." Back in the restaurant, Donovan found the name, Alara Vanescu. The first name matched. He found a grainy news clip from an old European tournament. The headline read, 14-year-old prodigy Ilara Vanescu on the brink of history. He hit play. The video showed a younger, fiercer version of the woman across from his boss, her eyes burning with an intensity that transcended the poor video quality. He watched her play with a speed and confidence that was breathtaking. Then he fast-forwarded to the end of the final match. He saw the confident prodigy's face crumble, her expression shattering into one of such profound despair it was painful to watch. His phone buzzed. It was a reply from an intelligence contact he kept on a permanent retainer. Ilara Vanescu, born Bucharest, Romania. Immigrated to U.S. with younger brother Liam in 2015 after death of father, coach Andrei Vanescu. Changed name to Vance. Liam Vance suffers from an advanced form of leukemia. She works 2 service jobs to fund his treatment. 0 recorded chess activity since April 12, 2014. Donovan felt a cold dread snake down his spine. He looked from the dossier on his phone to the woman at the board. The prodigy, the ghost, the broken champion. The game had reached its crescendo. Alistair was fighting for his life, his king desperately scrambling to escape a mating net that was tightening with every move. Ilara was playing with a chilling, inhuman precision. Donovan knew he had to intervene. This wasn't a game anymore. It was an execution. He stood, walked to his boss's side, and placed the phone on the table, the screen showing the old article with the picture of the 14-year-old girl. Alistair, his entire consciousness focused on the board, waved him away. Not now, Donovan. Alistair, look, Donovan insisted, his voice a harsh whisper. With a growl of pure exasperation, Alistair tore his gaze from the board and glanced at the screen. He saw the picture. He saw the name. Ilara Vanescu. The name detonated a bomb in his memory. The Wraith of Romania. A phantom who had blazed across the chess world like a comet before disappearing, spoken of in hushed, reverent tones by the few grandmasters he knew. He looked from the face of the heartbroken child on the screen to the face of the implacable woman sitting opposite him, the haunted eyes, the impossible skill. The crushing weight of her story settled on him. He wasn't playing against a waitress. He was playing against a legend he himself had dragged back from the dead. The sheer, monumental arrogance of his own actions struck him with the force of a physical blow. He felt like a man who had challenged a quiet old fisherman to an arm wrestle, only to discover it was a god in disguise. He looked back at the board, but with new eyes. He saw the beauty in her strategy, the brutal elegance of the prison she had constructed for his king, and then he saw it, the final move, the one she had been preparing for 10 turns. A quiet, humble pawn move that would trigger an avalanche he could not survive. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was inevitable. He looked at her one last time, and what he saw in her eyes was not victory, but release. Slowly, deliberately, Alistair Finch reached out his hand, not to make a move, but to tip over his own king in the universal sign of resignation. For a long moment, the only sound was the clatter of the ebony king falling on the board. The second game was over. The war was won. The surrender of Alistair's king was more powerful than any checkmate. It was an admission not just of defeat, but of inferiority. The invincible Titan had not just been beaten, he had been broken. He stared at his fallen king, but he was seeing the face of the 14-year-old girl on the phone screen, seeing the crushing weight of a gift she had been forced to carry and then forced to bury. His own world, built on the simple, brutal binary of winning and losing, suddenly seemed pathetically small and colorless. A single person began to clap. It was Donovan Hayes. Then another joined, and another. Soon the entire room, the staff, the few remaining patrons, the busboy holding the phone that had broadcast this silent epic to the world, were all applauding. It was not applause for a victor and a vanquished. It was an ovation for a ghost who had returned to life, for an artist who had, against all odds, created a masterpiece. Ilara flinched at the sound, as if waking from a long, painful dream. The attention, the accolades, this was the life that had destroyed her. Her first instinct was to flee, to disappear back into the shadows. Just then, Mr. Dubois, his face a mottled purple of rage and relief, shoved through the crowd. That's it. This circus is over. Vance, you are fired. Collect your belongings and get out of my restaurant. The applause choked and died. A collective gasp went through the room. The real world, with its cruel and petty rules, had returned. But before Ilara could even absorb the blow, Alistair Finch rose to his feet. He moved with a quiet authority that instantly commanded the room's attention. "No," he said, his voice soft but carrying the weight of undisputed power. "She is not fired." He turned to the apoplectic manager. "You, however," Alistair continued, his voice dropping to a level of cold fury that made Dubois physically recoil. You have demonstrated a profound and unforgivable inability to recognize true value. You are a liability. Have security escort Mr. Dubois from the building. He is trespassing," Dubois sputtered, but two imposing hotel security guards materialized and firmly guided him away, his career checkmated in a single, ruthless move. The room fell silent again. Alistair turned back to Ilara. The arrogant billionaire was gone, replaced by a man who looked humbled. "The wager," he said quietly. "I lost. I will honor it. I'll call my press secretary in the morning." Ilara looked at him. This man who had been her tormentor, her adversary, and now, impossibly, her champion. The punitive wager she had designed to humiliate him now felt hollow. She didn't want his humiliation. She wanted him to understand. "Why?" she asked, her voice clear and strong. "Why does everything have to be a contest for you? A win or a loss? Couldn't you just see the beauty of the game?" Alistair was quiet for a long time, his gaze lost in the middle distance. It was a question no one had ever dared ask him. "Because," he finally answered, and the honesty in his voice was raw and unguarded, "my father taught me that the world is a chessboard. You are either the hand that moves the pieces, or you are the piece that gets sacrificed. There is no in between. I built my entire life on that philosophy." He looked down at the board. "Until tonight. You didn't just play to win. You played to create something perfect. I didn't know that was possible." He paused, meeting her eyes. "I believe I also owe you the truth. You are Ilara Vanescu, the Wraith. It is an honor to have been your opponent." The name spoken aloud no longer felt like a curse. It felt like a reclamation. Alistair reached for the check he had written, the $500,000, and pushed it across the table. "This was not part of our wager," he said, "but take it, not as a prize, not as payment. Consider it reparations, and an investment in an artist who has been denied her art for far too long." This time Ilara did not refuse. She looked at the check, and she didn't see Alistair Finch's ego. She saw Liam's future. She saw a path out of the darkness. "Thank you," she whispered, the two words carrying the weight of a decade of pain. The king had surrendered, and in doing so, he had given the Phantom back her kingdom. The days that followed were a seismic shift in the landscape of Ilara's life. She walked away from the Aurelia not as a fired waitress, but as a local legend. The first order of business was to deposit the check. The bank manager, seeing the name Alistair Finch, handled the transaction with the reverence of a religious rite. The constant grinding anxiety about Liam's health, a poison she had lived with for years, began to drain away. Calls were made. Appointments were set with the top pediatric oncology team in the country. Hope, a feeling she had long forgotten, began to bloom in the barren soil of her life. A week later, a subdued Donovan Hayes met her at a small coffee shop. He explained that Mr. Finch had honored his wager. The Wall Street Journal had published a stunningly candid interview in which Alistair detailed the disastrous, ego-driven acquisition of a tech firm early in his career, a failure he had buried for 20 years. The financial world was reeling. Finch Global's stock had taken a hit. But Alistair, Donovan explained, seemed unconcerned. He had requested another meeting with Ilara. She agreed warily. The car he sent for her didn't go to a glittering skyscraper, but to a dusty, derelict building in a struggling neighborhood. A former community center shuttered for lack of funds. Inside, Alistair Finch stood amidst peeling paint and broken furniture. Not in a suit, but in jeans and a simple gray sweater. "I read about your father," Alistair said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "He dreamed of opening a free chess academy for underprivileged kids. He believed the discipline of the game could save them from the streets. Ilara stared at him, speechless. I wronged you, Ilara, he said, turning to face her. I took your gift and tried to make it a weapon in my own petty war. I want to make it right, not with money, with a legacy. He swept his arm around the cavernous room. This building is the first of many. I have established the Andrei Vanescu Foundation. Its sole purpose will be to build and fund these academies all over the country. Staff, equipment, scholarships, everything. It has a board of directors, a CEO, and an unlimited budget. He handed her a folder. On the first page was the foundation's letterhead. Listed as President and Chief Visionary Officer was the name, Ilara Vance. It's not a job, he said quickly. It's a kingdom, your kingdom, to run as you see fit. Teach children to see the beauty, not just the win. Teach them the way you play. It was an act of profound penance, of deep and startling understanding. He had listened to her question in the restaurant, and this was his answer, written not in dollars, but in brick and mortar, in purpose. He wasn't just giving her a future, he was helping her heal her past. She walked through the dilapidated hall, seeing not what was, but what could be. The sound of chess clocks, the excited chatter of children learning the Ruy Lopez opening, the quiet intensity of a tournament. She could see herself, not as a haunted prodigy, but as a mentor, a guide, honoring her father's dream without the crushing weight of his ambition. Yes, she said, her voice full of a certainty she hadn't felt since she was a child. I accept. A year later, the Andrei Vanescu Chess Academy was a beacon in the neighborhood. Ilara had discovered a passion not for competition, but for teaching. She was patient, brilliant, and beloved by her students, a diverse group of kids who found a refuge and a challenge over the 64 squares. She taught them how to think, how to focus, and how to lose with grace, a lesson she herself had to learn. Alistair Finch became a quiet benefactor and an unlikely friend. The business world noted a change in him. He was still a shark, but he had learned there was a difference between a hostile takeover and a strategic partnership. He had learned from Ilara that sometimes the most powerful position on the board is the one that creates value for both sides. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ilara sat on a park bench, a travel chessboard between her and her brother Liam. His hair was growing back, color had returned to his cheeks, and his laughter was strong and clear. The new treatment was working. He was in remission. I saw your exhibition match against the international master last week, Liam said, nudging a pawn forward. You crushed him. The internet is calling you the Queen of Chicago. Ilara smiled. She played occasionally now, in charity events to raise money for the foundation. The phantom still made appearances, but she was no longer a ghost. She was a queen, in full command of her own life. He blundered in the opening, she said with a shrug. Liam grinned. Your move. She looked at the simple game between them, played not for glory or money, but for the quiet joy of a shared moment. The sun was warm on her face. Her brother was healthy. Her future was her own. She picked up a knight, its familiar weight a comfort in her hand. She was no longer the waitress, no longer the haunted prodigy. She was Ilara Vance, and she was finally free. She made her move, her heart calm, her mind clear, playing a new game where every single square was a victory.